Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Thank you, Jane. Good afternoon to you. A standoff between the UK and Brussels seems likely after Theresa May rejected the EU's draft legal text on Brexit, saying no British Prime Minister could ever agree to it. Speaking in the Commons, she said the document, which proposes a common regulatory area between the EU and Northern Ireland, would threaten the makeup of the UK.
The draft legal text the Commission have published would, if implemented, undermine the UK common market and threaten constitutional integrity of the UK by creating a customs and regulatory border down the Irish Sea, and no UK Prime Minister could ever agree to it. I will be making it crystal clear to President Juncker and others that we will never do so.
In a moment, we'll speak to our political correspondent, Tom Rayner. But first, let's go to Brussels and our Europe correspondent, Mark Stone. Michel Barnier this morning saying that this should come as no surprise, but Theresa May making it very clear, Mark, that this is just not going to happen at all. So where next?
Yeah, there's been an avalanche of Brexit news today. It's hard to know where to begin, but at the crux of it is this legal text published by the EU side. It's a draft, and I think that much needs to be stressed. Under normal negotiations, you wouldn't expect a draft at such an early stage to be published. But in the way the EU is doing things, they are making everything transparent, and so they are publishing a draft which will be subject to negotiations, not only with the 27 remaining members of the EU, but with the UK as well. And so Theresa May is pointing out that she's not happy with specific aspects of this, and it is only a draft, so she hopes that her teams will be able to negotiate the bits she doesn't like away. Now, why is it so controversial? It all comes down to the Irish border. This draft text is a legal interpretation of the deal that was done in December, specifically on the Irish border. There were three possibilities that would solve the conundrum of the Irish border and how you maintain no border effectively between the North and the Republic. The first option was to have a rich trade agreement between the EU and the UK, which would mean that the border issue fizzles away. That's not yet a possibility. It may be down the line, but the Canada deal took some 10 years or so that's a long way off. The second option is technology, which means that the traffic going over the border and goods could be recognised that way. No one's provided any solutions about how that could work. And so the third option, the fallback option in December, was that somehow the whole of the UK would align with the Republic of Ireland in terms of EU regulation. That would mean the UK would have to remain in the single market and the customs union. That's not a goer. And so could Northern Ireland remain in the single market and the customs union? That too is no good for Britain. So that was the problem in December. The issue now is that third one, being the only realistic option, given that A and B are hypotheticals, that third one has weight, legal weight, in the document, and the UK doesn't like that. The point, though, is that it's only a draft, and down the line, options 1 and 2 might become a reality. Have a listen to what Michel Barnier said in his news conference today.
We have applied imagination and creativity to find a specific solution to the unique challenge that Brexit poses for the protection of the Good Friday Agreement. Two issues are key to avoid border checks. First, full alignment with the Union law on goods, veterinary and plant health rules. Second, our Northern Ireland has to be covered by the Union Customs Code. Our approach is focused on those areas where it is needed to avoid border checks. Daily life around the border should continue as today.
So on that Northern Irish border issue, it's nuanced, but the UK is saying that the joint report, the December report, was saying that if A and B didn't come to pass, then the option C would be a UK-wide thing, not the annexing of Northern Ireland specifically to EU rules. There are other issues as well. The joint report makes no mention of Northern Ireland being a rule taker, having to take part in the ECJ. It would be the whole of the UK. So there are specific problems that the UK has with this. There's one other issue briefly to bring you up to date on. It's emerged from a lobby briefing in the UK today, and it's to dealing specifically with citizens' rights. EU citizens living in the UK, after Brexit Day, there will be this 2-year or so transition period. What happens to them? If you were a French person, for example, you want to study in the UK, but your course doesn't start until after Brexit Day, can you still go to the UK? Is that still a possibility? Can you remain there and work there for the rest of your life? That's not been clear. Now the UK has clarified that position, and effectively, yes, you can. So if you move from the UK from the EU into the UK after March 2019, but before the end of the transition period, your rights will effectively be the same. You'll be able to stay for a period of 5 years, and if you reach that 5-year point and you have a job and all that sort of stuff, then you can stay indefinitely. That will be seen by some as a concession on the behalf of the British. The EU has been pushing for some time for rights for citizens to remain the same through the transition period. But crucially, that will be the same for Brits wanting to travel to the EU. It will be reciprocal. So that's a human aspect of Brexit that people who live either in the UK but aren't British, or the EU who are British will be interested in and probably pleased with.
OK, Mark Stone, thank you. Well, with Northern Ireland a major sticking point, Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn called for a guarantee from the government that it would not renege on its commitment to keep an open border.
The Foreign Secretary and I are absolutely committed to ensuring that we deliver on no hard border between Northern Ireland and Ireland. That's the position of the UK government, it's the position of the parties in Northern Ireland, it's the position of the Irish government, and it was what we agreed in the December agreement of that joint report. We are all committed to ensuring there is no hard border between Northern Ireland and Ireland.
Well, let's speak to Tom Rayner in Westminster for us. So we're in this standoff situation. Theresa May insisting there no border between Northern Ireland and Ireland, also saying that they're committed to no border in the Irish Sea. So where does this leave us?
Well, I think it's important to just explain what question Theresa May was responding to in that context, because Jeremy Corbyn was raising this memorandum that was leaked to Sky's political editor Faisal Islam last night, which seemed to suggest it was a memorandum from the Foreign Secretary to the Prime Minister sent earlier this month, and it seemed to suggest that Boris Johnson felt that there was a need to sort of roll back a bit from the commitment that the government has had thus far to having no hard border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. In that memo, Mr Johnson writes that it is wrong to see the task as maintaining no border, that the government really, he argues, should be looking to stop this border becoming significantly harder. That has been seized upon by the government's critics as representing the government saying one thing in public, this commitment to having no hard border, but in private contemplating whether or not that is possible given their red lines on not having a customs union. Now, when Sky News caught up with the Foreign Secretary this morning, he said that he wanted that letter to be published and indeed committed that he would. Let's have a listen to what he said.
What the letter says is that actually there are very good solutions that you could put in place that would obviate, that would prevent any kind of hard border. If you have the letter, then may I respectfully invite you to, since you've been reporting on it consistently, put it online, let your readers judge, your viewers.
So Boris Johnson making quite clear then that he thought he would publish that letter if we didn't. But it seems that he's been overruled because Labour were granted an urgent question in the House of Commons earlier about this specific matter. Emily Thornberry, the Shadow Foreign Secretary, was asking the questions. First of all, she was outraged by the fact that Boris Johnson himself had left the chamber and left David Lidington, Theresa May's de facto deputy, to answer the questions. But David Lidington, when asked about whether or not the government would publish this letter, said that it's not government policy to publish internal government correspondence. Well, we've now obtained a letter from Chris Leslie, who's a Labour MP. He's a leading figure in the Open Britain campaign group, which is opposing Brexit. And in it, he asks for the government to publish that letter in full, and specifically references the fact that Boris Johnson had appeared to say earlier that he thought that that was the right thing to do, to let people make up their own minds based on the full document. He also asks Theresa May to reconfirm whether or not it is the government's job to ensure that there's no hard border, and he poses the rather mischievous question of whether or not she agrees that the only way to prevent a return to a hard border on the island is for the whole of the UK to stay in the single market and the customs union, and will she consider reassessing her Brexit red lines? Well, that is certainly what the former Prime Minister, Sir John Major, has called on her to do earlier today, and I think we'll hear a bit more from him in a moment.
Thanks very much, Tom.
And there are, as Danny was saying, warnings that the worst is not over yet. There is more to come in the next 2 days, and we will, of course, have a full weather forecast later in the programme. The rest of the news now, and the Prime Minister has come under pressure over Brexit, both at home and in Brussels today. Here, the former Prime Minister, Sir John Major, criticised her handling of the negotiations, while in Brussels, the chief EU negotiator published a document which proposes keeping Northern Ireland in a customs union, unlike the rest of the UK, if no other deal can be reached. Theresa May said the idea could never be agreed to. We'll hear from Sir John Major in a moment, but first, with the latest from Brussels, here's our Europe editor, Katya Adler, a warning her report does contain flash photography.
In the historic process in which the UK leaves the EU, this is a big moment. The first legal draft of the UK's exit treaty. So how is it possible, you might ask, to have a draft withdrawal agreement already when Brexit negotiations are still ongoing? Well, this 120-page document is the European Commission's understanding of what has been agreed to date with the UK and of what it still wants to be agreed. So in here we see the divorce issues which were discussed but not finalised before Christmas, the rights of EU citizens in the UK and UK citizens in the EU after Brexit. Also, the financial settlement, the so-called Brexit bill, and the Irish border. Also in here, the transition agreement, but no details of a future EU-UK trade deal because those talks haven't even started yet. The document's paragraphs on Northern Ireland are particularly controversial. The EU's chief Brexit negotiator came out today to defend them.
We have applied imagination and creativity to find a specific solution to the unique challenge that Brexit poses for the protection of the Good Friday Agreement. Il y a trois options.
Mr Barnier said 3 options had been agreed with the UK to avoid the reintroduction of a hard border between Northern Ireland and the Irish Republic. But he said the UK hadn't yet come forward with details. So his backstop solution involves Northern Ireland remaining in a customs agreement with the EU and in parts of the single market.
You must also be aware of the potentially explosive effect in the UK of this Northern Ireland protocol. Is this perhaps intentional on your part?
I'm not trying to provoke or create shockwaves. I want these negotiations to be a success. But let me remind you that it was the UK's decision to leave, and as I've said from the beginning, nobody should underestimate the consequences of this action.
In Northern Ireland,
but the Prime Minister was having none of it.
The draft legal text the Commission have published would, if implemented, undermine the UK common market and threaten constitutional integrity of the UK by creating a customs and regulatory border down the Irish Sea. And no UK Prime Minister could ever agree to it.
The Prime Minister and the EU do agree a hard border between Northern Ireland and the Irish Republic must be avoided. But the Prime Minister's negotiating position is complicated by her government's reliance for parliamentary support on Northern Ireland's Democratic Unionist Party.
We didn't leave the EU to oversee the breakup of the United Kingdom. It would be catastrophic economically, never mind politically, for Northern Ireland to be cut off from its biggest market.
But this is not where the story ends. This document is a first draft to be amended by EU member states, then negotiated with the government, which has plenty to say about it. Katya Adler, BBC News, Brussels.
The former Prime Minister, Sir John Major, has called on Theresa May to offer MPs a free vote on the final Brexit deal with the option of putting it to the public in a second referendum. In a speech, Sir John, who campaigned to remain in the EU, criticised the UK's approach to Brexit and said many of its red lines are unrealistic. But a leading Brexit-supporting Conservative MP has described the speech as riddled with errors. Our political editor Laura Kuensberg reports.
Stop Brexit!
Stop Brexit!
Not a done deal!
The freezing protesters who've taken up a permanent berth in Westminster might have a new ally. The former Tory Prime Minister, Sir John Major, who says MPs should be allowed to approve or block the final Brexit deal or give you a second referendum.
Nobody can truly know what the will of the people may then be. So let Parliament decide or put the issue back to the people. I don't enjoy being out of step with so many of my party, and I take no pleasure at all in speaking out as I have today. But it's as necessary to speak truth to the people as it is to speak truth to power. This decision is far more than a party issue. It's about the future of our United Kingdom and everyone who lives in it.
His case, Theresa May's trapped by her Brexiteers. The current plot has a bad ending.
She is being boxed in by people who are setting up hurdles that it is very difficult for her to jump and very difficult for the European Union to jump. And the end product of this, no doubt, in the minds of those setting those hurdles, is that the European Union will say no, and then it will be said, well, we haven't got an agreement because of these wicked Europeans, and therefore we leave with no agreement and a very hard Brexit. That is not in the interest of this country.
There is a risk, though, does it not? Is there not? From what you've said today, just sounds like someone who was on the losing side of the argument, and you don't want to accept it.
That's the cheap response to anything that's said. Are the 16 million people who were deeply upset that we voted to leave the European Union expected to be absolutely silent and accept everything that is said by other people, even when they believe it is to be damaging? That's not real. That's absolutely not real, Laura. Of course they must speak up. We are a democracy.
But isn't democracy also respecting the result of the referendum?
Nobody knew in any detail what the outcome of the referendum really meant.
The Prime Minister relies on the support of a vocal group of Brexit backers.
Prime Minister, who's going to blink first?
But she, like they, has no truck with another vote.
The government has given Parliament and will give Parliament the right to say whether they agree with what's been negotiated or not, and that will be it. And I think that's the right thing to do. We have to leave because the British people have said we should leave.
Ministers may gnash their teeth at this intervention, but it's cheered some of the Tory restive troops.
John Major is right. We should have a free vote, and if it is absolutely the will of the people, then this process that was begun by the people of this country must be finished by the people of this country.
But is he really helping? Didn't he complain his predecessor was a backseat driver?
Why should Theresa May tolerate what you're doing this afternoon?
This is the first occasion I've spoken on this for many, many months. Unless my memory serves me ill, Margaret spoke on a weekly basis, not once in many, many months.
Hard to believe now the referendum was meant to end Tory fights. With a year to go, the future shape of the country at stake, there are plenty of scores to settle.
And I have to say, in some government quarters, there was frustration at Sir John Major's intervention, just at the moment where Theresa May is striving to hold together an uneasy truce in the Tory party. But on his point of view, he chooses his interventions and his words carefully and rarely. And clearly for those inside the Tory party and around the country who don't think this whole battle is over, they may well give some comfort. But we will see, Sophie, how Theresa May answers this demand and the rest of the very, very long list of them that are being put to her door in her own big Brexit speech on Friday.
Laura Kuensberg, thank you.
Brussels published the first draft of the treaty for Britain's exit from the European Union today, with proposals for Northern Ireland instantly causing controversy. It suggests that it stays within an EU common regulatory area if no other solution can be found. But Theresa May's insisted that no UK Prime Minister could ever accept that. Our Europe editor James Mates has the details.
It was only 2 short months ago that Theresa May made an early morning dash to Brussels to sign up to a compromise on the Irish border and keep the Brexit talks alive. That was a fudge and everyone knew it. But today the fudging had to stop as 120 pages of dense legal text arrived on London's doorstep. And suddenly, now in black and white, December's carefully crafted compromise didn't look anything like as attractive. Within moments, Michel Barnier, the EU's chief negotiator, was fighting off suggestions he was being provocative.
I'm not trying to provoke, I'm not trying to create any shockwaves. I want these negotiations to be a success, but it is my responsibility to recall that it is the UK which decided unilaterally to leave the EU.
The most controversial passage in the draft text suggests that if nothing better can be found, post-Brexit there would be a common regulatory area where the territory of Northern Ireland shall be considered to be part of the customs territory of the Union. In other words, the customs border would then be in the Irish Sea. This withdrawal agreement addresses in great detail avoiding a border on the island of Ireland, but seems to accept that there can be one in the Irish Sea. Why is that?
You would probably be the first to say that the European Union is intruding into the domestic affairs of the United Kingdom. I mean, be logical.
Irish politicians are insistent that this is what Britain had shaken hands on as a fallback position.
Maybe the draft text is a wake-up call, certainly not from an EU perspective because we've known these details, but to our UK counterparts to say, look, this is what you agreed to in December.
There is much talking still to be done.
Keep calm and be pragmatic.
But the atmosphere between London and Brussels is suddenly distinctly colder. James Mates, ITV News, Brussels.
And our political correspondent, Romilly Weeks, is live at Parliament for us now. Romilly, give us some more on how the Prime Minister reacted to that Brussels document.
Well, pretty strongly, because the idea that there could be any border in the Irish Sea is like a red rag to the DUP, who, of course, the Prime Minister relies on for support here in the Commons. It's also really unpalatable to the Brexit wing of her party. So the Prime Minister today threw the idea right back at Brussels.
The draft legal text that the Commission has published, if implemented, would undermine the UK common market and threatens the constitutional integrity of the UK by creating a customs and regulatory border down the Irish Sea. No UK Prime Minister could ever agree to it, and I will be making that absolutely clear.
That's all very well, but the Prime Minister also reaffirmed her commitment to no hard border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland without explaining how that can be achieved. And as if she wasn't under enough pressure from all sides today, her predecessor, Sir John Major, weighed in, criticising the government's approach to the negotiations and also suggesting that the only way to heal the divisions at the end of this process is to have a free vote on the final deal and also on the possibility of a second referendum, which is not, presumably, the sort of advice that the Prime Minister wants to hear right now.
Romilly, thank you.
The border between Northern Ireland and the Republic has again become a dividing line in the Brexit negotiations. Within an hour of the European Commission publishing a draft legal text that proposed a common regulatory area on the island of Ireland, Theresa May was on her feet in the Commons saying that no UK Prime Minister could ever agree to it. Later, the former Conservative Prime Minister told Theresa May her Brexit policy is unrealistic. Sir John Major said maybe the public should have the chance to vote again. Our political editor Gary Gibbon has this report.
Since the peace process, you have to draw on the border around Northern Ireland to find it. And that, the EU says, is how it must stay. The draft treaty published by the EU negotiator today was condemned by Theresa May. It lays out how Northern Ireland could stay subject to the EU rules after Brexit, aligned with its neighbour Ireland, while the rest of the UK goes its own way.
I'm not trying to provoke, I'm not trying to create any shockwaves. I want these negotiations to be a success, but it is my responsibility to recall that it is the UK which decided unilaterally to leave the EU on the basis of the outcome of a referendum.
Earlier, Mr Barnier briefed European commissioners on the fallback position now set out in treaty form. If the whole UK doesn't stay aligned to the EU or come up with some other solution to keep the border completely invisible, the The EU says Northern Ireland would have to stick with EU rules, just like Ireland does. Theresa May told MPs that was completely unacceptable.
The draft legal text that the Commission has published, if implemented, would undermine the UK common market and threatens the constitutional integrity of the UK by creating a customs and regulatory border down the Irish Sea. No UK Prime Minister could ever agree to it.
Except, of course, that's exactly what Theresa May did as recently as December. In this, the joint report of the UK and the EU, shaken on just at the end of last year. Here it says if both sides can't find another solution to the Northern Ireland issue, then there will be a Northern Ireland that stays in the customs union without the rest of the UK and is subject to a lot of other EU apparatus too. What's different about this, the 120-page draft treaty published today, is that it's a legal text. It goes into a lot more detail. In theory, the EU is asking Britain to sign this or something that looks a lot like it. One cabinet minister said this document was all just about kicking the issue down the road. This one is of a different order.
Michel Barnier acknowledged the original December document included other options. Britain is still hoping to agree, but EU officials have repeatedly suggested they're unlikely to work.
We're not talking about speeches, fine words or declarations. We're talking about a treaty, an international agreement, one that is legally valid, that's serious.
Back in December, when the idea of Northern Ireland staying in the customs union and aspects of the single market first came up, it nearly toppled Theresa May and brought down the talks. This time round, the government's been much more careful about trying to soothe its DUP allies and their friends on the Tory backbenches. The Prime Minister, as promised to them privately beforehand, gave a stern rejection of the whole idea, and the DUP turned their fire on Brussels and not number 10.
Quite rightly, she has kicked it out of the ballpark. There's now a big job to do to rewrite it. And whether that can be done in the time which is available, I'm not so sure.
But there was incoming fire from Theresa May's own team. A predecessor, Sir John Major, said her negotiating position had set up extremist, unrealistic red lines.
Our self-imposed red lines have boxed the government into a corner. They are so tilted to ultra-Brexit opinion, even the Cabinet cannot agree them.
Sir John Major said Mrs May should have the courage to let MPs vote with their consciences on the final deal and maybe even allow a second referendum.
This must be a decisive vote in which Parliament can accept or reject the final outcome, or send the negotiators back to seek improvements, or order a referendum so the public may approve what has been determined.
Number 10 is hoping a blast from the past won't count for much, and that today's strong exchanges with Brussels about the draft treaty won't stop progress on the transition deal it wants to agree next month. It quietly climbed down on a pledge to restrict freedom of movement during the transition to try to keep that timetable on track.
Gary Gibbon. Well, when I spoke to Sir John Major earlier, I began by asking why he thinks Theresa May and her government are not being straight with the British people.
Well, I think they've set out the situation as they see it. I do think they have sought to do that. But I think there are many things that haven't been said. And I think what hasn't been said is the extent to which the evidence is rapidly emerging that many, many people are going to be very worse off, whatever form of Brexit is now chosen. Now, as the evidence emerges that every single form of Brexit that anyone has tested leaves us worse off as a country and worse off as individuals, people have to reflect and focus on what the emerging deal may actually mean to their lives. And I think if nobody tells them that, they would have every reason to feel aggrieved. We were told during the referendum campaign that we'd have unimpeded access to the single market. Many people no doubt voted, because immediately after they voted for Brexit, opinion polls said they wished to remain in the single market. Well, you can't just ignore that and say, oh no, we voted for Brexit, so therefore that must mean we leave the single market. That simply is not logical.
But is there any Brexit? Is there any Brexit that could be in the national interest?
There's no Brexit that will leave us as well off as we are now. I can conceive of none, and neither can any of the economic bodies that have looked at it.
I reported you when you were Prime Minister, and I've never seen you so passionate about an issue as I see you here and now. And I'm wondering, how close to what you called national self-harm do you think this country is?
Well, I think we're very close to national self-harm. I do feel very strongly about this. I remember very well where I came from. I know what it is like when the week is longer than the money. And that is going to be the position for people in the future unless we are very careful in how we negotiate this Brexit. I have never known our country so divided on so many issues. I have never known our institutions, whether it is the politicians or the police, as disregarded as they are at the present time. And that is immensely damaging and immensely dangerous. We cannot ignore that. We have to look at reality and we have to follow policies. I hate making a speech which I know will cause friction with my own party. It's not in my nature to do so. I never have done so. But I just simply cannot sit there and watch us moving in a direction that I am utterly convinced is going to be damaging for millions of ordinary people who ought to expect better from their parliament.
But you know what the Brexiteers are already saying.
I have no
You, John Major, are trying to frustrate the will of the British people.
Yes, well, that's because they've no argument. The only argument they've ever got is we're frustrating the will of the British people. 37% of the British people voted to leave Europe. 63% either voted to stay or didn't vote. And since the Brexiteers spent the whole of their time talking about the sovereignty of Parliament, they can hardly object if I suggest Parliament now effectively takes control and decides at the end whether this is the right Brexit for us or not. The Brexiteers are the last people in the world in any position to argue against those points that I made this afternoon. It won't stop them, of course, but it is ludicrous of them to do so.
We are an elective democracy, and you've talked already of the sovereignty of Parliament. Why are you prepared to envision a referendum, a second referendum, under certain circumstances? Why not under no circumstances?
Well, I'm only prepared to do it because it would be authorised by Parliament. That was the point I definitely made, that I would prefer the matter to be solved in Parliament. But if Parliament felt, because of the divisions in the country, that they had to consult the country again, then Parliament should determine there should be a second referendum.
Even when you were Prime Minister, perhaps particularly when you were Prime Minister, that split in the party was wrecking your attempts to produce all sorts of measures.
Yes.
Why should the country have to pay for the splits in your party?
Well, I don't think the country should pay for the splits in any party. But I freely admit, just as the people who are ultra-Brexiteers disagree with almost everything I say, I have very little traction with their policies. But they are, in terms of the Conservative vote in the country, a minority. And the suggestion that we should desert the party and leave the ground for them to take over is not something that appeals to me at all.
You're in for trouble, you know that, don't you? I mean, there will be abuse, there will be hatred, and there will be despising comments made. Have you factored all that in?
I was aware of how what I said would be twisted and turned and used. I'm not naive about these things. I'm not a novice. My purpose is not to speak to them. My purpose is to speak to the people out in the country who all they have heard in the Brexit debate is the slogans on one side or the other. All they've heard is the philosophical arguments about taking control or being a Eurocrat and a Europhile. Whereas behind those arguments are solid, hard facts that affect people's lives. And if I can get through to some of those people, then it will have been a very worthwhile exercise from my point of view.
Sir John, thank you very much for talking to us.
My pleasure, thank you.
Well, now back to our main report tonight on Brexit. I'm joined now from Westminster by Jonathan Powell, who led the negotiations for the Good Friday Agreement during his time as Tony Blair's Chief of Staff. Remember, today's the day when Europe has published a pamphlet in which it looks very much as if they have proposals that are unacceptable to the government on Northern Ireland, and by the pro-Brexit Conservative MP, Jacob Rees Mogg. Jacob Rees Mogg, let's just begin on the intervention of the former Prime Minister, your former Prime Minister, John Major, Conservative, and the rest of it. Now, he can accept the idea of a second referendum, something you used to embrace but don't any longer. Why?
Well, I didn't embrace it. I made a speech in the House of Commons saying it was possible to set up a system where you would have a mandate referendum to send the Prime Minister out to negotiate and then have a referendum on the result. That isn't what the legislation provided for. I think this is characteristic of the European elite's contempt for democracy.
Hang on a moment. You just haven't quite explained why you dumped the second referendum.
Because we didn't have the mandate referendum in the first place. The idea being discussed at the time was that there should be a mandate referendum for the Prime Minister to negotiate with the European Union, and that once he'd negotiate, you should vote on the deal. The government didn't go with that. They decided simply to have a vote on the deal, and the government sent a leaflet to every household saying that the result would be final and that we wouldn't be in the single market once we had had the vote if we voted to leave. And that the issue of a second referendum is basically the characteristic contempt of the European elite for democracy. You saw it in Ireland, you've seen it in Denmark. When they have a vote that goes the way the EU doesn't like, they're made to vote again. I don't think Britain is that sort of country. I don't think we will be bullied or forced to vote again.
So I can sense a sense of delight in your voice when I listened to what John Major said, which was there'll be a free vote. There should be a free vote. This is such a big moment for this sovereign parliament of ours, that the MPs within it will be allowed to have put country above party and vote in the interests of Britain. You're thrilled about that, I can tell.
Well, I always take the view that I should vote as I think fit, and I'm always interested in what whips have to say, but don't always follow it. But this is the same
But you wouldn't like to accord that to other MPs?
Hold on, this is the same John Major who instigated, was in charge when the most aggressive whipping in modern history went on over the Maastricht Treaty. He is the man who presided over the most integrationist treaty that was taking place, and people were sworn at, they were pushed, they were bullied, they were told that they would be deselected if they didn't follow the whip that John Major authorised. Either he's forgotten how he behaved in the past, or he's the most frightful humbug, and your viewers will be able to judge.
I can't understand why you choose to have a free vote yourself on so many other issues, but you're not prepared to accord it to one which is actually about the entire destiny of this country.
Because every MP is free to vote as he or she thinks fit. It's up to them whether they follow the whips or not. I've never criticised Anna Soubry or Dominic Grieve or others who have voted against the government. I think MPs ought to deliberate and consider, but the government is entitled to ask people to vote in accordance with the manifesto, which was quite clear on this issue.
Let me bring in Jonathan Powell. Jonathan Powell, isn't there a slight danger that people will see the establishment, your old boss, Tony Blair, and the old Prime Minister, Sir John Major, ganging up against the will of the British people?
No, I thought John Major's speech was excellent. I thought he set out exactly a coherent, a clear case, and people can make their decision listening to the speech and listening to what he thought. I didn't really have any disagreement with it at all.
Well, now, you drew up this agreement. You negotiated it on the whole of question of the peace in Northern Ireland, a brittle and perhaps brilliant achievement at the time. How much danger is it in?
Well, I think it is in danger. We've seen the Brexiteers starting to say that the time has run out for the Good Friday Agreement, that we ought to throw it overboard in order to allow a hard Brexit to go ahead. And I think that's a very rash judgment to make. The Good Friday Agreement has stood us very well for the last 20 years. It's allowed us to have peace in Northern Ireland. It's allowed us to have proper politics in Northern Ireland. And to suddenly decide that it's worth sacrificing at this stage seems to me a very, very misguided.
Jacob Rees-Mogg, is it worth sacrificing the peace in Northern Ireland, the deal over the border and everything else just for Brexit?
I'm unaware of any Brexiteer who is in favour of abandoning the Good Friday Agreement. It's Jeremy Corbyn, incidentally, who voted against the Good Friday Agreement when it came to Parliament. It is very important to maintain peace in Northern Ireland, of course it is, and the UK has made it clear it won't implement a border, and that is something we can do unilaterally. What I think is the current problem is that the European Union has
let me just rest you on your point there. Let's just check. Is this something we can do unilaterally, Jonathan Powell?
No, what Sir Jacob Rees-Mogg is saying is that we could unilaterally decide not to have a border and lead it to the EU to put a border in place. Because, of course, the EU would need to have a border because it couldn't have a gaping open back door to the single market through Northern Ireland. So there would have to be a border there. But saying the EU does it instead of us makes no difference at all. It still endangers the peace process because you still have a hard border. So it doesn't answer anything. The point that Jacob Rees-Mogg made about no Brexiteers, 3 Brexiteers, Daniel Hannan, Kate Hoey, and Owen Paterson have both in recent weeks suggested we should ditch the Good Friday Agreement. The time has run out on it And the reason they're doing that, and the reason that Boris Johnson is writing letters suggesting a hard border, is exactly because they can see the problem of the Good Friday Agreement, the problem of the hard border, is standing in the way of the hard Brexit they want.
There's absolutely no need for a hard border. It's absolutely right that it would be up to the EU to enforce it, but the Irish government has said it doesn't want a hard border, which the Irish government would have to implement. The issue is where there are customs arrangements, but there's already differences in VAT, differences in immigration rules that apply north and south of the border in the island of Ireland. The real danger is what the Commission has suggested today, to try and detach Northern Ireland from the United Kingdom and put it in the customs union and in the single market, when the rest of the UK won't be. Now that is a real threat to peace, because that is a really aggressive proposal to make to the unionists in Northern Ireland. The DUP cannot possibly accept that Northern Ireland should be separated from the rest of the United Kingdom, and indeed it would, if the government went with it, undermine the supply deal that the DUP has done, the confidence and supply deal the DUP has done with the government. So the government would risk falling over it, and it's an astonishingly aggressive move from the Commission.
Jonathan Powell?
The EU has not issued an aggressive paper today. What it has simply done is put into legal form the agreement reached in December between the Tory government and the EU. That's all that it's done. It's taken the only option it can put into legal form, because it's the only real option, which is the backstop one, of Northern Ireland remaining in the single market and in the customs union. The other two proposals put forward by the government have no real form, so they can't put that into legal form. Now, there are basically a series of contradictions in the December agreement, because Theresa May promised different things to different people. She promised the DUP there'd be no border across the Irish Sea. She promised the Irish government there'd be no hard border north and south. She promised the Brexiteers we'd leave the customs union as a single market. And she promised the EU there'd be regulatory alignment between north and south. You can't have all these things, and we've now left the phony war. We're approaching crunch time. We have to make up our minds which of these we're going to do, because you can't have the Good Friday Agreement and leave the single market and the customs union. You have to choose, and those difficult choices are now coming up.
Jonathan Powell, Jacob Rees Mogg, I'm sorry, but we're out of time, but thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Questions over what will happen to...
Now, a quick but important correction. Jacob Rees Mogg earlier incorrectly said that Jeremy Corbyn had voted against the Good Friday Agreement. He did not vote against the Anglo-Irish Agreement. See our fact check on our website.
There's no sign of a ceasefire in the Tory party over Brexit. Today, Sir John Major made that very clear with his depth charge of a speech calling for a free vote in Parliament on the final Brexit deal, with the option of a second referendum, and hence the possibility of remaining within the EU. Always a passionate Remainer, the former Prime Minister has denied he's trying to undermine Theresa May. But one of the ultra-Brexiteers he was taking aim at, Jacob Rees Mogg, said that Major was all cheap comments and propaganda. Timing is, of course, all, and today's EU draft legal agreement has particular resonance for Sir John, whose dogged work on the Northern Ireland peace process finally led to the Good Friday Agreement. The idea of a common regulatory area for Ireland was rejected immediately today by the Prime Minister. So is the man who, as Prime Minister in 1993, faced his own hell at the hands of the Maastricht rebels, now in full rebellion himself. One of those Maastricht rebels is here, but first, so too is Nick Watt. Now, Nick.
Europe, a storm that has consumed successive Conservative Prime Ministers. When this one was bundled out of office, she promised to keep an eye on this one. When he exited the stage, he promised to be more friendly and was supportive of this one. But today, he cast his own shadow.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone.
The mild-mannered former Prime Minister, usually punctilious and polite to a fault, eviscerated Theresa May on Brexit.
For the moment, our self-imposed red lines have boxed the government into a corner. They are so tilted to ultra-Brexit opinion, even the Cabinet cannot agree them, and a majority in both Houses of Parliament oppose them. If maintained in full, it will be impossible to reach a favourable trade agreement.
The intervention by the former Prime Minister echoed the private fears of many Remain members of the Cabinet who've been biting their lips. An old foe who clashed with the former Prime Minister on Europe was surprised to hear him call for a free vote in Parliament on Brexit.
During Maastricht, there was such a strict whip imposed that there were a whole bunch of Conservative MPs who lost the whip for voting against the whip. Basically, that means being kicked out of the party in Parliament. And they were stateless, as it were. And then people were shipped in by ambulance and all sorts of things to comply with the vote. Such was the benign and kind nature of the then regime, which I do believe was, in fact, at that stage led by John Major.
Pro-Europeans welcomed Sir John's intervention.
You go into a negotiation knowing that you are going to have to make some concessions in return for gaining some. And he quite rightly pointed out that every time we create a red line, Europe in turn removes options from the table for the UK.
Sir John chose a significant moment to issue his warning. A few hours earlier, the EU's chief negotiator upped the ante by tabling a series of demands that trampled all over the UK's Brexit red lines. A new European Commission draft of the UK-EU withdrawal treaty calls for a common regulatory area between Northern Ireland and the Irish Republic if the UK and the EU fail to negotiate a comprehensive free trade deal. A definitive role for the European Court of Justice in policing the withdrawal agreement. Theresa May rejected the EU's proposals, which could place a border within the UK between Northern Ireland and Great Britain.
The draft legal text the Commission have published would, if implemented, undermine the UK common market and threaten constitutional integrity of the UK by creating a customs and regulatory border down the Irish Sea. And no UK Prime Minister could ever agree to it. I will be making it crystal clear to President Juncker and others that we will never do so.
In Downing Street, officials acknowledge that the Brexit negotiations are entering a crunch phase ahead of a showdown summit in 3 weeks' time. Ministers leaning to the Brexit side believe that the EU is turning the screws to improve its negotiating position. Other ministers fear that the long, drawn-out process to reach a cabinet consensus on the future trading relationship has provided an opening that the EU is exploiting.
Even a Prime Minister cocooned in their security bubble cannot escape the UK's chilly visitor from the East. When the elements turn, it can feel like the world is closing in.
And Nick Watt is here now. We've got some late reaction tonight.
That's right. I've just been speaking to Lord Howard, the former Conservative leader, about that John Major speech. He says it's very sad that the former Prime Minister cannot come to terms with the results of the British people. Now, you'll remember Michael Howard had run-ins with John Major when he was a member of his cabinet in the 1990s over Europe. He was one of the cabinet ministers labelled by John Major as a bastard. So I asked Lord Howard how that feud is going. This is what he had to say.
Well, he certainly wasn't very keen on free votes at that time. No question about that. Indeed, I mean, the speech is sort of full of rich ironies. I seem to remember that when he was Prime Minister, he was quite upset about the interventions of one of his predecessors. I think it was called backseat driving in those days.
Now, the Cabinet is going to meet tomorrow to approve the decision by the Cabinet's Brexit subcommittee to have the end-state negotiations pursuing an ambitious managed divergence. That really is going to set the countdown, a 3-week countdown to the European Council at the end of March, where hopefully guidelines will be agreed on the future, the nature of the future trading relationship. So I asked Michael Howard what he thinks of that cabinet decision we're likely to get tomorrow. This is what he had to say.
I do think it's realistic. It's realistic because the European Union, at the end of the day, wants a deal. It wants a deal on goods and services because it sells more goods to us than we do to them. It uses London not because they love us, but because it's the most efficient capital market in the world. And they want a deal because they want our money. And without a deal, they won't get it.
Like I heard, thank you very much, Nick. Well, I'm joined now by one of those Maastricht rebels who made John Major's life in office a misery. Sir Bill Cash rebelled the party whip 48 times during the period and is now chair of the European Scrutiny Committee. Good evening to you.
Hello.
I just want to start with a tweet today by George Osborne.
Oh, yes.
And he says, why the synthetic Brexiteer anger over the EU text on the Irish border? Number 10 made key concessions in December. They made a deal in which you all cheered. In the absence of agreed solutions, the UK will maintain full alignment with those rules of the internal market and the customs union. It's all bluster.
Well, look, I mean, basically what they've said in this draft legal text, and my European Scrutiny Committee are looking at that right now. Bottom line is that what they're trying to do is to create a constitutional crisis in the UK. I mean, this is basically the EU which is seeking to achieve this hard border, when actually they've said they don't want it. We have also said we don't want it, and the Irish government has said they don't want it.
But actually,
nothing synthetic about this. They've actually created trying to create a constitutional crisis.
No, but the truth is that actually the question of the Irish border is a key issue in Brexit. It isn't some kind of fake argument. You have a situation here now where you've either got a customs union or you've got a border.
Well, look, if you take, for example, that we've got the euro at one end of Ireland and we've got the pound at the other, you've got different fiscal arrangements, you've got different corporation tax. There are differences already within Ireland, north and south.
So do you believe it could just be like Boris Johnson says, something like the London congestion charge?
Well, I'm not going to go down that line, actually, but what I will say is Bertie Ahern, who was the Taoiseach in Ireland, said...
Why won't you say that? Because nobody's prepared to say what actually would be put in place from the British side just now. We're still waiting.
I don't agree with that, actually. We put forward proposals, and those proposals are based on the fact that there are technical ways of dealing with it. And Bertie Ahern, actually, who was the Taoiseach, actually said you can turn a blind eye to a lot of the local trade, and that most of this stuff...
A blind eye?
Well, there's a man called Lars Carlson, I think his name is, who's Swedish... expert on customs. He says it's perfectly feasible to do it. There are real experts who are saying that, and the EU are trying to dig in over this in order to create maximum trouble for the government. It's very, very obvious.
But also the Conservative government is there, with the goodwill of the DUP. Do you think what you are fighting for is worth threatening the Good Friday Agreement?
Well, it's not threatening the Good Friday Agreement. You heard the Prime Minister only today. She said, we're standing by the Good Friday Agreement. Everybody was going to stand by the Good Friday Agreement. The bottom line is that this is a synthetic argument, to use the expression that you've just thrown at me, from George Osborne, of all people, the author of Project Fear. This is the synthetic part of the argument is coming from the EU. There is no need for them to do this, but they're doing it in order to create maximum trouble for our negotiations.
By John Major's speech today, it is very clear that there is no harmony in the Conservative Party, never mind, in Conservative membership, over the question of what kind of Brexit there should be, if indeed there should be a Brexit. Now, he famously called you one of the bastards during the Maastricht Treaty. Do you think he's being that very person just now?
Well, I'm not really totally bothered. I thought I was watching another edition of Spitting Image, actually, when I watched the speech that he gave today. I actually think that the real problem here is that he can't come to terms with the fact that he's lost the debate. And actually, it's much worse than that, because when you actually examine what he says, and he talks about conscience voting, when he talks about a second referendum, I do remember a thing called the Maastricht referendum campaign, which I organised with some friends.
Yeah, you wanted free votes. Give them a free vote now.
Actually, as a matter of fact, the position was that there was neither on Maastricht nor, for that matter, in relation to the Lisbon Treaty, have there ever been any free votes on this question.
It's Bill Cash. Thanks very much indeed.
I've been getting